Welcome to the Zone. In today's episode, we're going to dive into the STALKER Iceberg. It's a compilation of theories and speculation regarding the greater STALKER storyline and the world. The idea for this video came from a subscriber, both here on YouTube and Discord, Rusty Shackelford, who requested that I take some time and look into some of these interesting points in the greater STALKER lore. Without further ado, let's dive in. Level 1. This is the very tip of the iceberg diagram that was provided to me, and it has very vanilla themes, which is to be expected, as this is literally the tip of the iceberg. X Labs. A pretty simple one for anyone who's played the games. The X Labs are underground research sites that were set up throughout the zone for clandestine research projects. Call of Chernobyl. Again, this is a very simple one. Call of Chernobyl is a very popular sandbox mod for STALKER Call of Pripyat. You can check it out and download it on ModDB. Scar killed Fang. Pretty standard if you played the game. Scar is the protagonist of STALKER Clear Sky, and he killed Fang, a member of Strelk's group. Shooting the military under the bridge. In the cordon, instead of paying the military at the checkpoint to pass through, or going through the tunnel in the cordon, you can simply shoot the military and move through. Doing so gives you some nice gear, and also will put some nice guys as replacements there at the checkpoint. The Sea Consciousness. The primary antagonist of the STALKER series. This is a collective consciousness comprised of multiple personalities that was merged into one. The Sea Con is responsible for a monolith, anomalies, emissions, and pretty much all the other bad things in the zone. Crossing the tunnel anomaly. In Shadow of Chernobyl, the tunnel anomaly can be crossed pretty easily. The Electro moves in a systematic pattern, and once you get this pattern down, if you time it correctly, you can simply walk behind the electric arcs as they move across the ground. Level 2. Moving on to stuff that most people should know, but they may have missed, we have Level 2. The Darkscape. This was a cut area that connected the Dark Valley to the cordon. It was originally intended to be a connecting area that led from the cordon via a train tunnel through a long crescent canyon into the Dark Valley. Supposedly, this part of the game was supposed to integrate the original driving mechanics that were designed early in the development of Shadow of Chernobyl, where Strelok would be chased by a helicopter through a long canyon road. As we know, the driving mechanics are scrapped for a variety of reasons, causing the team to remove the area completely. Thankfully though, many mods have integrated this originally cut content, so you can certainly check it out and see what it's all about. General Tachenko. Some of you guys may already know the name of this soldier, but for those who don't, he's the founder of Duty. Like many of the survivors of the early expeditions into the zone, Tachenko and his team were left for dead after a deadly emission almost completely wiped out his task force. He gathered the remaining survivors around him and led them to create Duty, a faction dedicated to stopping the spread of the zone's influence on the wider world. The Zatin Controller. This one is pretty interesting to me, and it adds a bit of depth to the mutants that inhabit the zone. During the events of Call of Pripyat, you can encounter a controller in a cave in Zatin. This controller, unlike his mutated brethren, will call out to you before attacking. He will warn you to stay away, implying that the controller either feels fear for his life, or is attempting to hide from other humans out of shame. It's interesting to encounter mutants that simply want to avoid combat and have a shred of humanity that's left inside of them. There's also the possibility that the controller was attempting to fool you into a false sense of security, making it a little bit easier to kill you. Either way, it adds a level of complexity to the mutants that lurk in the zone. The Mercenary Clients. Another important plot point to think about is the Merc Clients. In the game, we are given very little information about who is behind the hiring of the mercenaries that operate in the zone. In fact, the mercenaries themselves are dead set on keeping this information obscured, considering their level of OPSEC. While it is possible that there are multiple clients employing the various mercenaries across the zone, it's almost certain that the client is an organization or individual of Western origin. From the equipment that the mercenaries use, to their accents, Everything points to these soldiers of fortune being paid in Western currency. This employer could be a private corporation, a government, even a powerful individual. The most likely explanation is that the mercenaries are operating illegally in the zone under the employment of a Western government. Artifacts can be used to repair armor. This is a very widely known feature in Stalker, and personally, I would have put it on level 1. Artifacts can be stacked on your person, and by doing so, you can enter various anomalies which will begin to repair your armor. The artifacts correspond to the particular anomalies that will do this. A complete list can be found on the Stalker wiki page. Level 3. Now we're finally under the ice, and we get to see some of the beautiful and more obscure elements of the Stalker series. Charon as Scar. For those of you who have played through Stalker Clear Sky, you'll probably remember the climactic fight between Strelok and Scar at the very heart of the zone. After their fateful encounter, there's a massive emission that results in the capture of Strelok. We can see a cutscene where the survivors of Clear Sky and Strelok are being brainwashed and converted into monolith soldiers. The first half of this cutscene is viewed through the eyes of another character, one that we can only presume to be Scar. Knowing that Scar is heavily implied to be the one looking around in the first part of the cutscene, it should be assumed that he was turned into a monolith soldier. We see later in Shadow of Chernobyl that the leader of the monolith soldiers, Charon, uses the same weapon as Scar, the Vintar BC. While we don't know for sure if this is the same person, it's certainly implied that it is. It is certain that Scar survived the blast and that he was turned. However, we cannot be sure that Charon is Scar. Charon could have simply taken this weapon for his own and relegated Scar to a more common role within Monolith. Personally, it all adds up to me, and to be frank, it's a very cool story arc for Scar. Build 1935. This is a later build of Shadow of Chernobyl, commonly known as Oblivion Lost, which brought new maps, weapon textures, and stats to the game. It contains changes to the maps, NPC placement, and new scripted mutant encounters. The files are still floating around for this build and can be found on ModDB. Noosphere. While I've already done a video discussing this, the noosphere is actually a now-defunct pseudoscientific theory. It's proposed that there was a hypothetical field that was responsible for the operation of human consciousness. It's obvious that the dev team took heavy inspiration from this theory, and it's easy to see why. The noosphere itself is a very complex and mysterious concept that could be easily put into a video game or a movie setting, and I think that it was used very well in Stalker. But what is more interesting than using a defunct scientific theory for your science fiction setting is actually attempting to study the noosphere in real life, which is exactly what Professor Roger Nelson does at the Global Consciousness Project. This Princeton professor has been working on shared consciousness since the 90s, and has also led the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, which focuses on parapsychology. If we ever start seeing bloodsuckers and anomalies in real life, we'll all know who to thank. Lost Alpha. Lost Alpha is a standalone community-created mod for Stalker, which prioritized integrating originally cut content back into the game, as well as implementing some interesting storylines. There are many added locations, such as the Darkscape and Dead City, as well as vehicles. It's very interesting to see the original vision that GSC had for this game in its early development, and it really makes me think that with the right budget and timetables, Stalker could have been a much more mainstream title. You can find the files for this mod on ModDB as well. I would suggest playing it for some very interesting plot points as well. Morlocks, Universal Soldier. While this may have the same title as the best Jean-Claude Van Damme movie of all time, as well as a kind of similar theme, that's about where the similarities end. The Morlocks are a cut content mutant that was originally supposed to dwell in the tunnels under Pripyat. These creatures' origins were supposed to be the result of a failed project titled Universal Soldier, where a government project to create super soldiers went horribly wrong. It's implied throughout the games that mutants are a result of horrific experiments done to unwilling subjects, and they're not simply accidents. The addition of the Morlocks would have made this point canon. There was actually a mod put out under the same name in 2018, but it was soon abandoned. It's possible that he was going to implement a story containing these mutants. Next, we move on to level 4, where things get a little bit more interesting. LeManc's Time Machine. This is a pretty interesting one that I only stumbled upon later in Stalker Anomaly. In Pripyat, there's a building that contains an almost hidden door, which leads down to the basement. This door is much easier to access in Stalker Anomaly, but it can still be visited in Call of Pripyat. In the basement, there's a curious brick wall with a small gap in it, allowing you to catch a glimpse of a very interesting looking machine. I tried for almost an hour to get into the room, wondering what this could possibly be. When I finally surrendered and searched for an answer on Google, I found that the machine in question was actually an Easter egg for the fans of an old Soviet TV show called Guests from the Future. While I was a little sad that the machine doesn't actually do anything, it was cool to see that GSC had given a little nod to those who may have grown up watching that TV show. Dead City. The Dead City was originally supposed to play a much larger role in Shadow of Chernobyl before it was cut from the game. It was supposed to be populated by bandits and mercenaries, and act as the main HQ for the mercenary faction within the zone. Most of the story that takes place within LeManc's was actually intended to be set within the Dead City. When this area was cut from the game, LeManc's became the spiritual successor to the area. The very dark and creepy vibe LeManc's possesses in the original release would have also been kept in the Dead City, helping the area live up to its cursed name. Swamps. The great swamps that were first showcased in Stalker Clear Sky were actually supposed to be part of the original Shadow of Chernobyl game. Like many other game assets, the swamps were forced to be cut due to time and budget constraints, which is pretty well known. The map was added to Shadow of Chernobyl with build 1935. The original swamps were also supposed to be much larger than the Great Swamps that were released with Clear Sky. The zone is growing. This one is a pretty standard theory. It states that the zone is constantly expanding with each emission. During the events before Clear Sky, we see that every time there's an emission in the zone, it expands in some fashion. While the emissions that we see taking place before the events of Clear Sky are generally much larger and more violent than the ones we see in-game, we know that the emissions are new sphere energy being released into the zone. After the destruction of the sea consciousness, it's theorized that the now uncontrolled emissions are causing the zone to expand. Metro 2033 Stolen Assets. This isn't really a theory, but more of a fact. 4A Games, the studio that developed Metro 2033, was founded by previous employees of GSC in 2006. The creative director of Metro had a huge falling out with the CEO of GSC over royalties and unpaid wages, which led to him leaving with a few other key members to found their new development company. The engine that they used to create Metro was called the 4A engine, which was very similar to the X-Ray engine, as they used their previous experience from working with the X-Ray engine to develop their own. 4A even utilized some of the unused assets from Shadow of Chernobyl, such as the Lurker, which was repurposed as the Watchman. While some of these were pretty interesting subjects, now we move even deeper into level 5, where cut content is king. Lift Anomaly. The Lift Anomaly was a cut anomaly that was originally supposed to exist in Shadow of Chernobyl. The Lift Anomaly would reduce the gravitational force in a small area, which caused any object or person crossing its event horizon to float off of the ground. It's presumed that the anomaly was cut due to budgetary and time constraints, although the pellicle artifact that it was supposed to spawn still exists within the vanilla Shadow of Chernobyl. The Rusty Hair Anomaly. The precursor to the Burnt Fuzz Anomaly, known as the Rusty Hair Anomaly, was a cut anomaly that acted very similarly to the anomaly that replaced it. Rusty hair could originally be seen growing out of metallic objects such as cars, machinery, and metal roofs. This reddish-black hair would grow almost like rust, spreading over any exposed and oxidized metal. Touching these fuzzy growths resulted in massive biological damage to the victim, causing terrible burns and equipment damage. This anomaly was later removed and replaced by the burnt fuzz, so that a more balanced and non-threatening environmental hazard could exist. Bread. One of the most common questions that people will ask when playing through Shadow of Chernobyl for the first time pertains to an item that you will find after killing Borov in his office. You can't really do anything with the bread, and the quotations around the name seem to suggest that it isn't what it appears to be. While there is no in-game function for this item, I personally think that it was meant to be a hiding place for another item, almost like a dugout or a holobook. While we can't know exactly what the bread was supposed to be originally, it is certainly fun to think about. In fact, I'm pretty sure the developers of Stalker Anomaly utilized this meme to create their own anomalous bread artifact, the only consumable artifact within the game. Posthuman. The Posthuman was a cut mutant that was featured in one of the original drafts of the Shadow of Chernobyl script. This was a key element in a story arc concerning the Chernobyl Scientific Research Institute of Parapsychology. The original depiction of this mutant was that it was tall and pale, with huge black eyes that contrasted its face. These creepy mutants were the product of secret experimentation on human test subjects in an effort to expedite the next stages of human evolution. These creatures possessed telekinetic and psychic abilities, which were a result of the posthumans having heightened consciousness. In the original story, an unknown force directs a group of controllers to attack the research site, destroying the test data and killing the research team responsible for carrying out the experiments. The Creature in the Fog. The Creature in the Fog was originally supposed to act as sort of a boss battle near Yantar Lake. This creature was organic in nature and was protected by a metal container of some sort. The creature was probably the result of the experiments taking place in Lab X-16, which was the original plot device that explained the zombification of the lab personnel. The creature would have been protected by mutants and zombies. Zombie Hitmen. I think that this one refers to the mission, where you are to assassinate the crazy freedom soldier just outside the army warehouses. While there are various translations in the description for this stalker, he was labeled as a zombie in the English version, rather than Crazy Freedom Stalker. I've been told by a friend who recently downloaded Shadow of Chernobyl from GOG that this translation issue was fixed. When I find my original Shadow of Chernobyl CD, I'll reinstall that version and compare the translations. This is a very interesting translation error. Moving on to the next level, where things get even more deep. Tourist Delight. Tourist Delight is made out of people. It's people. Stalker 2 Cut Story. The original Stalker 2 story that was dropped when GSC was unable to get funding for a sequel had the zone expanding and consuming more parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The story was scrapped when the studio dropped the game from its development pipeline. It'll be interesting to see how much of this storyline that they use for Stalker 2 if it does come out in December. X-16 Director's Suicide Note. Inside of Lab X-16, you can find a note depicting the circumstances concerning the death of a Pavel Stepanovich Prodoko, the director of the clandestine research site. In this letter, he outlines exactly what happened when their failed pseudo-brain project originally launched. He details how instead of the brain ensuring that any unsuspecting explorer near the laboratory would be oblivious to their existence, it instead began to force personnel to kill any uninvited intruders. Pavel theorizes that the brain had begun to learn on its own, surpassing its original programming and becoming something more. After attempting to destroy his creation, he realizes that he does not have the means to physically accomplish this task, as he is the only remaining sentient person in the lab and trapped in the only room with psi protection. He realizes that he will soon die or become another unwilling servant of the brain. He understands that there is no way to fight back against the threat, and with no supplies or hope of rescue, his situation soon becomes hopeless. Rather than wait for his inevitable death, he chooses to commit suicide. Here are some of his last words. "If I leave the room, the psi radiation will destroy me as a person. My pistol cannot do anything against this bulletproof glass. All the guns were taken by our guards. It's now possible to turn off the complex only from the backup control panel. I led myself into a trap. Water and supplies ran out a week ago. If I leave the room, the psi radiation will destroy me. For the remaining short days, I will live life like a vegetable. I don't want to, so I kept the last bullet in my pistol. Sin. Sin is a very popular cut faction that was originally supposed to be part of Shadow of Chernobyl. Comprised of what were known as Dark Stalkers, the members of Sin appeared to be mutilated and almost zombie-like. They would have scarred faces and cover their bodies with long, dark trench coats, carrying out their questionable activities throughout the zone. The faction originally had a role similar to that of Monolith, as they worshipped the zone as a manifestation of the divine. The faction was cut early in development, but vestigial elements still exist in Shadow of Chernobyl, such as hidden text in the game files. The Sin faction was reintroduced in Lost Alpha, and is spread to many other Stalker mods. Well, we're almost done, and we're getting pretty deep. This second to last level has some of my favorite pieces of lore on this iceberg list. Fang's Two Graves. While playing through Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl, you may run into this little paradox. In the description of Fang's goodie stash, the flavor text states that Fang is buried under a monument in Pripyat. However, in the army warehouse, there is a grave marked Fang, which indicates that Fang is actually buried in a different location than what was stated. This problem can be answered in a few different ways, the first being simple development oversight. It could have been the case that the dev team originally wanted Fang's stash to be in the army warehouse, but they later moved it to Pripyat for story reasons, and simply forgot to remove the old gravesite. It could also be something that points to Fang's history as a character, that he was thought to have been killed in the army warehouses, but he survived. After his near brush with death, he could have made it up to Pripyat before finally being killed. It's also possible that he could have faked his death for unknown reasons, or that there's simply more than one stalker in the zone that chose a cool name like Fang. The Rostock factory is real. This is a simple but interesting one. The Rostock factory that you see in Shadow of Chernobyl is actually based off of a factory in real life. It's pretty interesting stuff. Savior. Savior is the name of a character that we only see in Shadow of Chernobyl during a cutscene, but he plays a pivotal role in the story. Being the one that drugged Strelikin from almost certain death from exposure, Savior is one of the main reasons that the story of Shadow of Chernobyl could even take place. While this on the surface seems to be a great thing, there are more sinister answers here. Savior bears a very striking resemblance to Scar from Clear Sky, in that he wears a trench coat and carries a Vintar BC, the same equipment that Scar is showcased with. While the facial features of the two characters did not look too similar, the fact that we know Scar survived to be brainwashed by Monolith, and that Strelick was operating as an agent of the Sea Consciousness at this time, points to the Savior deliberately rescuing Strelick in an effort to get him to complete his mission. Even if Savior is not in fact Scar, because as we mentioned above, a more common theory lists him as Charon, Savior rescuing Strelick and no other victims of the death truck crash certainly seems suspicious. We know that like Strelick, there are other stalkers walking throughout the zone, unwittingly carrying out the will of the Sea Consciousness. Maybe this was a prime example of that happening. Parasite. One of the other cut mutants from early in the development of Shadow of Chernobyl, the Parasite was supposed to be a fungal-based life form that took control of infected hosts. The Parasite's original home was supposed to be in the Dead City, which also acted as a possible ground zero of the fungal outbreak. Upon inhaling or coming into contact with one of these deadly spores, the host would immediately begin to become infected as the spores multiplied. The spores would begin to cover the victim's head as their internal organs were eaten away, only to be replaced with new fungal growths. During the later stages of infection, the victim would develop large growths on their head. Small appendages and tentacles would protrude from the new head, which aided in its ability to feed on local fauna. Originally, the mutants were supposed to be contained within the Dead City, as an early plot line that had the player helping Duty contain the outbreak. But later in 2003, the story was changed again, placing the mutants all over the zone. The idea was scrapped later that same year, and its position in the plot was most likely replaced by the zombified stalkers that we see in Shadow of Chernobyl. The real reason behind Stalker 2's cancellation. While it's commonly stated that Stalker 2 was forced to be cancelled due to the development team not being able to attract investors for the new game, it's been hypothesized by some on the internet that there are far more nefarious reasons hidden from the public. One of the more popular reasons for this cancellation involves the use of the X-ray engine to develop real-life artificial intelligence for the CIA. While this is a crazy one, there are other even more crazy ideas floating around, and they all circle around Pepsi addiction, poisoned Pepsi, and aliens. On to the last level of our iceberg. At this depth, not even the most autistic and lost souls can return. You have been warned. Journalist. One of the very early characters that were cooked up for what became Shadow of Chernobyl was the journalist. This elusive and furtive man was originally charged with acquiring documents from the various X labs scattered throughout the zone. While this character was cut very early on into the story, there was a fairly large body of lore surrounding the journalist's activities. In fact, there's a large part of the game where the player was following in the footsteps of Journalist, until finally meeting up with him at the end. You can find more information about Journalist on the Russian Stalker Wiki. Children of the Zone. One of the more interesting pieces of lore that comes from the Russian novel Roadside Picnic, and more specifically the character of Monkey. Monkey was born as one of the Children of the Zone, which were children born to those who had entered the zone and had been exposed to the radiation and energies there. While those who had entered the zone are still able to have children, an unforeseen effect of being exposed to the zone's environment is that children of the zone are born horribly sick or deformed, considering the Stalker takes very heavy inspiration from Roadside Picnic, and considering that the zone has noosphere energy as well as insane amounts of radiation. It's not far-fetched to think that the same fate awaits stalkers who sire children. Any stalker who did manage to make it out of the zone could be met with the same fate of those in Roadside Picnic, where their entire lineage is cursed to be a reminder of the hellish landscape that is the zone. Sendplan.doc. Sendplan.doc is a file that contains the original concepts and endings of Shadow of Chernobyl. Originally, the monolith was an ancient device left by extraterrestrials that was intended to speed up the evolutionary process of humanity. The damaged monolith in this iteration of the story was capable of changing or halting the evolutionary process of all humans. This device was the center of the early draft of the story, and the endings are based around your decision regarding what to do with the monolith. If the monolith was not destroyed, it would eventually result in 90% of humanity mutating into various subspecies all across the world as evolution was accelerated. These different subspecies would eventually begin to fight amongst themselves, resulting in an endless war raging across the surface of the Earth. The winner of the fight would be the next step of human evolution. If the monolith was destroyed, humanity would remain in its current state, leading to evolutionary stagnation and eventually the extinction of mankind as humanity ceased to adapt to its changing environment. Stalker is real. Obviously, if you haven't seen the real-life expeditions into the zone on my channel, you should go check those out. But if you have, and you need more proof that Stalker is actually real, nothing proves this more than the current fighting going on in Ukraine. Most people will buy into the narrative that Russia has invaded Ukraine for an easy land grab and to slake Putin's lust for blood, but the true story is far more horrifying. The reason that the majority of NATO countries have begun to funnel weapons and supplies to the Ukrainians is to ensure that the Russians cannot access their wish granter, which would cause the alternate history storyline of Red Alert to become reality. In fact, it's pretty obvious that the sea consciousness has begun to influence political leaders all over the world, proving that the noosphere can be manipulated from halfway around the world. It won't be long until the sea consciousness decides that the best course of action is to cause World War III, leading to an inevitable nuclear war, finally ending with the complete subjugation of the remainder of mankind. If this doesn't convince you, take a look at your local Walmart. You'll get visual confirmation that mutants have begun to spread outside the zone. This is happening, and you can't stop it. Strelick joined the sea consciousness. Moving on to something much more fun to think about, we have the last theory that rests at the bottom of this Marianas Trench. The theory states that, in fact, Strelick never escaped the control of the sea consciousness, and that he never actually destroyed it. The ending cutscene in Shadow of Chernobyl was simply a mental image placed into his mind by the sea consciousness. All of the events taking place after Shadow of Chernobyl are actually designed to further the sea consciousness's goals. During the ending of Call of Pripyat, Strelick leaves the zone with the military to serve as an advisor of some sort. Having an agent embedded in the Ukrainian military would allow the sea consciousness to continue to expand its influence, as the intelligence that Strelick could provide would be misleading at best, and unknowingly ensure that the Ukrainian government would allow the zone to further expand. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm glad that you made it to the end, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy the video, feel free to like and subscribe for more Stalker-related content. If you'd like to help support the channel financially, check out the merch store in the description or head over to my Patreon for more information. Until next time, I'll see you in the zone.